They treated him like any other contractor trying to cross into the restricted zone, an elderly man with a weathered passport and no military ID. Then the biometric scanner triggered a protocol the young Marines had never seen before, one that locked down the entire base network and initiated an encrypted SATCOM link directly to the Joint Chiefs. The checkpoint sat at the western perimeter of Forward Operating Base Sentinel, 23 miles from the Syrian border. Staff Sergeant Michael Carter had been processing entry credentials for 9 months, long enough to recognize the usual patterns. Contractors arrived in convoys with advance manifests. Aid workers came with NGO escorts. Military personnel carried proper identification. The old man who stepped out of the dust-covered Land Cruiser at 02:47 p.m. fit none of these categories. He wore civilian clothes faded by sun and dust, carried a single leather briefcase worn smooth at the corners, and moved with the deliberate care of someone whose body remembered younger days. Carter estimated him past 65, maybe older. Silver hair, weathered skin, eyes that seemed to absorb everything without revealing anything. No escort, no advance notification, no visible anxiety about entering a combat zone 18 miles from active hostilities. Carter accepted the passport without comment. Standard diplomatic cover, blue with gold embossing, the kind issued to State Department personnel and certain other government employees whose work required international travel. The biometric scanner beeped as it read the RFID chip embedded in the document's cover. Carter turned to log the entry in the system. Routine procedure he'd performed 3,000 times. The screen went white, not black, not frozen. Pure white, as if every pixel had simultaneously decided to display nothing. Carter tapped the keyboard. Nothing changed. He glanced at Corporal Ramos at the adjacent terminal. Her screen showed the same blank white display. Within 15 seconds, every computer terminal visible through the checkpoint facility's windows had gone white. The radio crackled with confused reports from the main gate, from the armory, from the operations center. Every networked system on Forward Operating Base Sentinel had locked down simultaneously. Chen looked back at the old man, who stood exactly where he'd been, hands loose at his sides, expression unchanged. No surprise registered on his face, no confusion, no concern. Just patient waiting, as if he'd expected this exact sequence of events. The white screens flickered once. Red text appeared in capital letters. Credential verification in progress. Stand by. Carter had processed over 4,000 entry credentials since arriving at FOB Sentinel. He'd never seen that message before. Neither had anyone else at the checkpoint, based on the confused radio chatter now flooding the communication channels. The secure phone rang, the red handset that connected directly to the base operations center. Carter picked it up and identified himself. The voice on the other end was tight with controlled urgency, asking specifically about the passport scan that had just occurred. Carter described the individual. There was a pause, the sound of rapid keyboard typing. Then the voice returned with new instructions that made Chen's stomach tighten. Detain the individual. Do not allow him to leave the facility. Base commander en route. Corporal Ramos moved to the old man's position, her hand near her sidearm but not drawing it, her voice professional when she asked him to step into the checkpoint office. The old man complied without protest, without question, as if this too was expected. He set his briefcase on the metal table when instructed, and remained standing with his hands visible, a detail that suggested familiarity with security protocols. Carter contacted the main gate to trace the vehicle that had delivered him, but it had already disappeared into the chaotic traffic patterns of the local contractor convoys, untraceable without advanced surveillance. 3 minutes later, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Vance arrived in a Humvee that left dust hanging in the superheated air. She was the base commander's executive officer, a by-the-book infantry officer with 2 combat deployments, and a reputation for zero tolerance of security breaches. She entered the checkpoint office and studied the old man for several seconds before turning to Carter and requesting the passport scan log. Carter pulled up the records on a handheld tablet, one of the few devices still functioning. The entry was there, time-stamped precisely at 02:47 p.m. But where the passport number should have displayed, there was only a string of asterisks and a classification notation Chen had never encountered. Tier 1. Verification required. Vance's expression hardened. She'd been in the military long enough to know what Tier 1 clearances meant. They didn't belong to consultants or reconstruction coordinators. They belonged to intelligence operatives working in denied areas. Special access program personnel conducting operations that didn't officially exist, and individuals whose mere presence could shift the balance of classified missions. She turned to face the old man directly, her voice carrying the weight of command authority. The old man met her eyes without flinching, his voice quiet but clear when he responded that his identification was being verified through appropriate channels and suggested they wait for that process to complete. Vance noted several things in that moment. The old man had correctly identified her rank despite her name tape being deliberately turned inward on her tactical vest. He'd used the phrase appropriate channels with the casual familiarity of someone who understood bureaucratic security protocols. And most telling, he showed absolutely no concern about being detained by armed Marines in a combat zone. That kind of calm came from either profound confidence or decades of professional training in high-stress environments, but what happened in the next 4 minutes would force everyone on that base to reconsider everything they thought they knew about authority. The computers came back online all at once, synchronized as if controlled by a single master switch. The screens displayed normal desktop interfaces, but every terminal now showed a priority notification banner across the top. Security alert, Tier 1, credentials authenticated. In the operations center, the secure SATCOM terminal was ringing. The classified line that connected directly to Central Command in Tampa, Florida. Major David Bennett answered and found himself speaking to a 2-star general, whose name he recognized from intelligence briefings. The general's first question was direct and left no room for misunderstanding. Where is the individual who triggered the Tier 1 alert at your checkpoint? Bennett confirmed the man was detained at Checkpoint 3. The general's response was immediate and carried the weight of absolute authority. Release him immediately. Provide full base access. Do not interfere with his movement or question his presence. Confirmation code Echo 7 Delta 9. Park wrote down the authentication code, verified it against the classified matrix, and felt his hands go cold when it checked valid. Echo 7 Delta 9 was a priority override code, the kind that superseded normal chain of command and carried direct presidential authority in specific circumstances. He contacted Vance immediately, relaying the instructions verbatim. Vance looked at the old man, who remained seated with his hands folded on the table, expression unchanged, as if he'd known exactly how this would unfold. She informed him he was free to go. The old man stood, collected his briefcase, and thanked her with a slight nod. Then he made a simple request that carried the unmistakable tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Transportation to the operations center would be appreciated. Vance arranged for a Humvee. She accompanied him personally along with Major Bennett, neither of them speaking during the quarter-mile drive through the base. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, heat radiating off the armored plating in visible waves. Inside the operations center, personnel moved with focused intensity, monitoring drone feeds and radio intercepts from positions across the region. The base commander, Colonel Marcus Holloway, waited in his office, a soundproofed room equipped with encrypted communications gear. He was a career infantry officer with 3 combat deployments and a reputation for running disciplined operations. When the old man entered, Holloway didn't offer his hand, his posture cautious and his voice controlled when he stated that while he'd been instructed to provide full cooperation, he hadn't been told who he was dealing with or why. The old man set his briefcase on Holloway's desk and opened it with practiced efficiency. Inside was a tablet computer, a secure satellite phone, and a leather credential wallet. He removed the wallet and presented it to Holloway without comment. The colonel opened it and his expression shifted immediately, the blood draining from his face as he processed what he was seeing. The credentials identified the old man as Thomas Mercer, Senior Operational Liaison for the Defense Intelligence Agency's Special Activities Division, with security clearances that extended beyond anything Holloway had personally encountered in 15 years of service. But more significantly, the documentation included a presidential authorization code and a letter bearing the signature of the Secretary of Defense. The letter specified that Mercer's presence in any operational theater carried immediate authority over intelligence collection, threat assessment, and tactical response coordination. Holloway looked up from the credentials, his voice quieter now when he asked what brought Mercer to Forward Sentinel. Mercer's response was measured and precise. He explained that 72 hours earlier, signals intelligence had intercepted encrypted communications, suggesting a weapons transfer operation in the region. Not conventional arms, but materials that raised immediate proliferation concerns. The intercepts indicated the transfer would occur within a 30-mile radius of Forward Sentinel's area of operations, and the timeline suggested it would happen within the next 18 hours. Holloway felt the weight of that information settle over the room like physical pressure. He asked why this operation hadn't been communicated through standard channels, why Mercer had arrived unannounced rather than through proper military coordination. Mercer's explanation revealed layers of complexity that made Holloway's stomach tighten. The communications intercepts included coded references that suggested insider knowledge of coalition force movements. Someone with access to classified operational schedules was providing information to the hostile network, facilitating the transfer. That meant the normal communication channels couldn't be trusted, that any advance notification of Mercer's arrival or purpose would have compromised the entire operation. So Mercer had traveled through civilian contractor networks, using diplomatic credentials that triggered security alerts only after he was already inside the wire, ensuring that any potential insider threat would have no advance warning. But the complexity of the situation was about to become even more critical, because what Mercer hadn't yet told Holloway was that the weapons transfer wasn't scheduled for somewhere in the region. Intelligence indicated it was planned for a location less than 2 miles from their current position. Mercer activated his tablet and displayed a satellite image of the surrounding area. He highlighted a cluster of agricultural buildings northeast of the base, structures that had been surveyed and cleared as non-threatening during the base's initial establishment. Recent overhead imagery showed subtle changes: new vehicle tracks, thermal signatures inconsistent with farming activity, and suspicious patterns of movement during hours when legitimate agricultural work wouldn't occur. Signals intelligence triangulation placed the encrypted communication source within 200 meters of that exact location. Holloway studied the imagery, his tactical mind already calculating response options and risk factors. He noted that the building sat just outside the base's primary surveillance perimeter, but well within the range of potential mortar or rocket attacks. If hostile forces were staging materials that close to the base, the threat level was immediate and severe. He asked what kind of response Mercer was authorized to approve. Mercer's answer was direct and carried implications that made everyone in the room understand the gravity of what they were facing: any and all necessary measures to interdict the transfer and secure the materials. The next 6 hours unfolded with the precision of a military operation conducted under the tightest security protocols. Holloway activated a tactical response team from the base's quick reaction force, briefing only the team leader and keeping all other personnel unaware of the specific target or objective. Mercer coordinated with overhead surveillance assets, including a Reaper drone that was quietly redirected from its scheduled patrol route without notifying the normal operational channels. The drone's high-resolution cameras and signals intelligence package provided real-time monitoring of the target location. At 08:15 p.m., as the desert sun dropped toward the horizon and shadows lengthened across the compound, thermal imaging detected 6 vehicles approaching the agricultural buildings from the northeast. The vehicles arrived in a staggered pattern, separated by several minutes, a tactical approach designed to avoid attracting attention. Personnel dismounted and moved into the largest structure, a warehouse-style building with corrugated metal walls. Thermal signatures showed at least 15 individuals inside, their body heat signatures visible through the infrared sensors. Mercer watched the feeds on his tablet, his expression calm but his eyes sharp with focused intensity. He'd spent 38 years in intelligence work, much of it in operational environments where decisions made in seconds determined whether missions succeeded or personnel died. He noted the disciplined way the personnel moved, the security positions they established around the perimeter, the careful coordination that suggested military training. These weren't opportunistic criminals or untrained militants. They were professionals conducting a planned operation with tactical awareness. At 09:03 p.m., a 7th vehicle arrived, larger than the others, a covered truck that reversed up to the warehouse's loading dock. 4 individuals emerged and began unloading cargo, moving with the careful precision of people handling sensitive materials. The overhead imagery couldn't penetrate the covered truck bed, but the way the personnel handled the containers suggested significant weight and required caution. Holloway looked at Mercer, waiting for the authorization that would send his tactical team into action. Mercer watched for another 4 minutes, confirming that all vehicles had arrived and that the transfer operation was fully underway. Then he gave the order that set everything in motion. The tactical team moved from their staging position under cover of darkness, approaching the target location in a coordinated pattern that had been rehearsed hundreds of times. They wore night vision equipment and maintained radio silence, communicating through hand signals and prearranged movement patterns. The Reaper drone overhead provided continuous surveillance, its infrared cameras tracking every heat signature in the target area and confirming that the security positions hadn't detected the approaching team. At 09:34 p.m., the team leader signaled ready status. Mercer authorized immediate action. The assault occurred with overwhelming speed and precision, flashbang grenades creating disorientation while tactical operators flooded into the building from 3 entry points simultaneously. The entire structure was secured in less than 90 seconds, all 15 hostile personnel detained without a single shot being fired. The operators moved with the efficiency of elite soldiers who'd conducted these operations in dozens of combat zones over years of deployment. Inside the warehouse, the tactical team found exactly what Mercer's intelligence had predicted. 12 shipping containers, each marked with civilian agricultural labels but containing materials that made the team leader's blood run cold when he verified the contents. Not conventional weapons, not explosives, but specialized components for chemical weapons production, materials that were tightly controlled under international treaties and represented a severe proliferation threat if they reached their intended destination. The team leader reported findings over secure radio, and Holloway felt the full weight of what they'd just interdicted settle over him like a physical burden. These materials in the wrong hands could have resulted in attacks that killed hundreds, possibly thousands. The fact that they'd been staged so close to a coalition forward operating base suggested either breathtaking audacity or inside knowledge that made the operation seem feasible. But the most critical revelation was still to come, because when Mercer examined the seized communications, equipment and compared it to the signal's intelligence intercepts, he identified something that confirmed his worst suspicions about insider compromise. The encrypted communications device found in the warehouse was using military-grade encryption protocols, not civilian equipment or commercial systems. More specifically, it was using protocols that were only accessible to coalition forces with specific clearance levels. Someone with authorized access to secure communications had provided the hostile network with equipment and credentials that allowed them to monitor coalition operations and coordinate their activities accordingly. Holloway understood the implications immediately. There was a penetration of their operational security, someone on base or within the broader coalition structure who'd been compromised or turned. Mercer confirmed this assessment and explained that the communication device would be exploited by specialized technical teams to identify the source of the compromise, but that process would take time and required resources beyond what Forward Sentinel could provide. In the meantime, the base would need to operate under the assumption that their communications could be monitored and their operations potentially compromised. It was a sobering reality that changed everything about how they conducted missions in the region. The detained personnel were processed according to established protocols, photographed and fingerprinted, their identities run through multiple intelligence databases. 3 of them flagged immediately as known associates of weapons trafficking networks, individuals who'd been tracked by intelligence services for years but never caught with actionable evidence. 2 others carried identification documents that appeared legitimate, but showed subtle indicators of sophisticated forgery, the kind produced by state-level intelligence services rather than criminal organizations. Mercer spent the next several hours coordinating with headquarters, arranging for specialized teams to take custody of both the materials and the detained personnel, ensuring that the chain of evidence remained intact for potential prosecution. He worked methodically, showing no sign of fatigue despite being awake for over 20 hours, and operating in a combat zone at an age when most people were long retired. At 02:17 a.m., as the specialized teams arrived by helicopter to take custody of the materials, Holloway found Mercer in the operations center, studying satellite imagery of the broader region. The colonel poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot that had been brewing since evening and offered one to Mercer. The older man accepted it with a nod of thanks. Holloway observed that Mercer had conducted this operation without ever raising his voice, without pulling rank unnecessarily, without the ego that often accompanied high-level authority. He asked how long Mercer had been doing this kind of work. Mercer's response was quiet and carried the weight of decades spent in classified operations. Since 1987. 38 years of tracking weapons proliferation, monitoring hostile networks, and conducting operations in places that didn't make the news because they weren't supposed to exist. Holloway noted that most people would have retired long ago, would have chosen the comfort of a desk job or the peace of civilian life. He asked what kept Mercer in the field at an age when he could easily have stepped back. Mercer took a sip of coffee and considered the question for a long moment before answering. Because the work still matters. Because threats don't retire just because people do, and because someone needs to be willing to travel into contested zones and make the hard calls that prevent attacks before they happen. There was no pride in his voice, no self-aggrandizement, just the simple statement of someone who'd found purpose in service and couldn't walk away as long as that service remained necessary. Holloway understood that sentiment. He'd felt it himself every time he'd considered leaving the military, the pull of duty that transcended personal comfort or safety. At 04:45 a.m., as the last of the specialized teams departed with the seized materials, Mercer prepared to leave as well. His extraction would follow the same pattern as his arrival. Civilian contractor vehicle, no military escort, disappearing back into the network of aid workers and consultants that moved through the region's conflict zones. Holloway walked him to the checkpoint where it had all begun, where Chen and Ramos were still on duty, processing the morning convoy of supply vehicles. Mercer shook Holloway's hand, thanked him for his cooperation, and climbed into the same type of dust-covered Land Cruiser that had delivered him 14 hours earlier. As the vehicle pulled away from the checkpoint, Carter watched it disappear into the pre-dawn darkness and wondered who the old man had really been. The official reports would classify the night's operation at levels Carter would never be cleared to read, would reduce it to vague references about security operations and intelligence collection. But Carter would remember the way every computer on base had locked down simultaneously when that passport was scanned, would remember the calm patience of the old man as security protocols escalated around him, would remember the way officers who gave orders every day suddenly became the ones receiving them. Vance stood next to Carter as the vehicle's taillights faded into the distance. She'd been briefed on the basic outlines of what had occurred, enough to understand that the seemingly routine passport scan at Checkpoint 3 had been the trigger for an operation that prevented a serious threat from developing further. She commented quietly that most people would never know how close they'd come to danger, would never know that an elderly man carrying a weathered briefcase had been the difference between successful interdiction and catastrophic failure. Carter nodded. His understanding of the military world expanded by witnessing something that existed outside normal operational structures. The old man had carried authority that superseded rank and position, had operated with a mission that couldn't be communicated through standard channels, and had demonstrated the kind of professional competence that came only from decades of experience in the world's most dangerous environments. As the sun rose over Forward Operating Base Sentinel, casting long shadows across the compound, the rhythm of military operations resumed. Personnel conducted their assigned duties, processed their routine tasks, maintained the constant vigilance that life in a combat zone demanded. The computers functioned normally, the communications flowed through standard channels, and the night's events became classified entries in secure databases. But for those who'd been directly involved, the memory remained of the moment when everything locked down, when normal authority structures suddenly revealed deeper layers, and when a quiet man with a diplomatic passport proved to be something far more significant than anyone had initially understood. Some operations announced themselves with dramatic action and public recognition. Others unfolded in silence, known only to those who needed to know, protecting people who would never be aware of the threats that had been prevented. Thomas Mercer's career had been built on those silent operations, on preventing attacks that never occurred because he'd stopped them before they could develop, on interdicting threats that remained classified because revealing them would compromise the sources and methods that made interdiction possible. He'd spent 38 years in that world, aging from a young intelligence officer fresh from training to a senior operational liaison, whose experience was irreplaceable. He'd carry that experience into contested zones as long as the mission required it, as long as threats emerged that needed the particular combination of authority and expertise he brought to bear. The work didn't offer glory or public recognition, didn't generate medals or promotions at this stage of his career. It offered only the knowledge that somewhere, people lived their lives in safety because threats had been stopped before they materialized. For Mercer, that knowledge was enough. It had been enough for 38 years, and it would remain enough for as long as he continued to serve. The diplomatic passport in his pocket carried authority that few people fully understood. Credentials that opened doors and triggered protocols and identified him as someone whose presence signaled operations of critical importance. But to most observers, he remained simply an elderly man in civilian clothes, carrying a weathered briefcase, traveling through dangerous regions with the calm patience of someone who'd seen it all before and understood exactly what role he played in keeping the darkness at bay. And that, perhaps, was exactly how it should be.